Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the Out from the Shadows conference in our third year. I'm Dr. Jennifer Fish Ferguson, one of the co-founders of the conference, and welcome to our session this afternoon. One real quick warning for people. We're going to be watching a video that does have some disturbing content. The majority will be blurred out, but please be aware that that is part of this session. And hopefully we lean into the discomfort just a little bit and really hear this important message. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you David Amir Bayer, who is a Palestinian-American filmmaker, visual effects artist, and emerging media specialist. He spent the first few years of his life living in the occupied West Bank before settling in the United States. David received his MFA in film production from the USC School of Cinematic Arts, where he was awarded the prestigious Jack Nicholson Directing Scholarship. Due to his background, David is passionate about using film to create social change and advance marginalized people. His wife is of Jewish ancestry with family in Israel, and they both long for a world in which all members of their respective families can live in safety. David's films have won at various film festivals across the globe, including the International Student Film Festival, the San Diego Black Film Festival, the LA Diversity Festival, and the 5Rs, which is the Festival of Virtual and Augmented Reality. He has also directed and produced branded content for a variety of clients, including Ford, AT&T, Beats by Dre, Huggies, Marriott, Johnson & Johnson, and many more. David currently teaches film and new media at the University of Southern California and the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts. My pleasure to introduce you to David.
Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to listen. As a filmmaker, I find I'm more coherent when I can edit everything beforehand. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this work in progress cut of a video essay/documentary I've been working on. I'm going to drop a link into the chat right now because sometimes with Zoom, I've noticed that things can slow down a bit. And so if you're having kind of any issues, you can just go ahead and use that Vimeo link. Before I start the film, I really want to highlight that I think empathy is the greatest virtue that human beings possess. And if it's not clear from the film, I'll never fault anyone in the media for showing empathy empathy to the victims of October 7th. I just have trouble understanding why we can't show the same empathy for the 50,000 people who have died in Gaza since. All right. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to start playing the video now. Oh, do we have a question really fast? Oh, I see that. Sorry.
Hello, my name is David Amir Bayer, and I'm a Palestinian-American filmmaker. As you might imagine, the last year has been very difficult. And I'm in a somewhat unusual situation, because while I've lost family in Gaza, my wife happens to be Jewish, with family in Israel proper. And while many of our friends and family have surprised us with their support, we've also had to have some very difficult conversations. And we've wondered how some can look at the loss of life and just see collateral damage, while others see a genocide. In the first few months of the war, my wife had a painful phone call with a family member. Afterwards, she told me it was like that person was living in a different world. And when I look at a lot of the coverage from the mainstream media over the last year, I also feel like I've been staring into an alternate reality. There is an empathy gap that has been fueled by Western news outlets. And I believe that if the reporting were more objective, far more people would come to the conclusion that they've been watching a genocide. So I'd like to talk to you today about the gap between the world that some of us have been living in and the one we see on print and on screen. So instead of pontificating about deeply felt emotions, I'd like to start off with some clear data. Earlier this year, an open source analysis by The Intercept found significant bias in how the lives of Palestinians are covered by mainstream media outlets. At the heart of the Intercept study is the unequal way Israelis and Palestinians are reported on. As part of this study, The Intercept analyzed all coverage from the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post during the first 6 weeks of the war. Despite the fact that Palestinian civilian fatalities drastically outpaced that of Israel, mention of Palestinian lives lost actually trended down as the death toll went up. Boiling it down to cold hard numbers showed the following. For every 2 Palestinian deaths, the human beings of Palestine are mentioned only once by these outlets. For every Israeli death, the people of Israel are mentioned 8 times, translating to a ratio of 16-1. It's hard not to look at these numbers and get the impression that Israeli lives matter far more to the mainstream media than Palestinian lives. Just as concerning were the words used to discuss the victims of this conflict. Highly emotive language was nearly exclusively reserved when referencing Israeli deaths compared to their Palestinian counterparts. The terms slaughter and massacre were used at a ratio of 60 and 30-1 when journalists described the deaths of Israelis and Palestinians. Descriptions of the victims themselves were equally disparate. Sometimes even the word children would be far too humanizing for Western media to stomach.
On October 13th, the LA Times ran an AP report stating the following. The Gaza Health Ministry said on Friday that 1,799 Palestinians have been killed in the territory, including more than 580 under the age of 18 and 351 women. Hamas's assault last Saturday killed more than 1,300 people in Israel, including women, children, and young music festival goers.
In the space of just 2 sentences, we see that in Israel there are innocent children, but in Gaza there are only people under the age of 18. Another more subtle, yet no less dehumanizing bias can be seen in the constant use of the passive voice to describe Palestinian victims. Most of us probably remember being told by our English teachers to avoid the passive voice, yet somehow, some of the best writers in the country now find the passive voice incredibly useful when talking about dead Palestinians.
While outlets were happy to report on Israelis, quote, murdered by Hamas, these same sources frequently report that Palestinians have simply died or were found dead without attributing these deaths to the Israeli military, who has been confirmed to have shot or bombed the victims.
In general, when Western media chooses to acknowledge the death and suffering of Palestinians, it is often spoke about as if these people had died in a natural disaster, rather than were killed by the firepower of a US ally. While the Intercept study only focused on the period from October 7th to November 18th, 2023, we can still see these same trends ever since. As such, I'd like to take a look at a few case studies from just the last year. I will be referencing and using footage from the Al Jazeera documentaries The Night That Won't End, Israel's War Crimes in Gaza, and the Zateo film Israel's Real Extremism. I urge you to watch them all in their entirety.
On January 29th, members of the Hamada family were forced to flee Gaza City in hopes of finding safety from continued Israeli airstrikes. A small Kia sedan was crammed with 6 people, including 15-year-old Leanne Hamada and her 6-year-old cousin Hind Rajab. Hind had already been forced to flee multiple times during the conflict, and, in this case, she was doing so without her mother Wassam and her younger brother Iyad.
Sadly, the compact sedan lacked enough room to carry them all.
Shortly after they departed, the car was attacked by an Israeli tank.
Once again, it's important to emphasize that this was an entirely civilian group in a civilian vehicle, merely trying to get out of harm's way.
During the attack, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society received a panic phone call from Leanne requesting assistance.
Hello?
الو مرحبا عمو.
انت مش حد تدخل علينا.
الو مرحبا.
بقى تدخل علينا. الدبابة جنبك.
انتوا متخبيين؟
في السيارة احنا جنبينا الدبابة.
انتوا جوا السيارة؟ الو الو.
The line went dead. When dispatchers called back, Hind answered the phone this time.
ميتين؟ وهم هلا معك بالسيارة؟
As a dispatcher stayed on the line, other members of the PRCS contacted the Israeli military to request safe passage for an ambulance to rescue the girl.
الدبابة جنبية
الدبابة وين؟
جنبية
ما بدنا نخاف.
نحكي معي
أنا معك يا عمري، أنا معك.
After roughly 3 hours, the Israeli Defense Ministry provided the PRCS with an approved route for medical vehicles and gave them permission to commence with the rescue. A clearly marked ambulance left with 2 paramedics, but they soon reported via radio that they were being targeted by the Israeli forces in the area. A loud bang was heard shortly before all contact with the ambulance was lost. It took 12 days before IDF forces left the area and civil defense workers were able to confirm what was already clear from the audio evidence. All 6 people in the sedan, along with both paramedics, had been killed by the only military in the area with armored vehicles, namely the IDF. The ambulance appeared to have been destroyed by some kind of large munition, leaving behind only the burnt-out wreckage and the charred bones of both paramedics. 335 rounds of ammunition had been fired into the car, with all inside being struck and killed by the incoming fire. Unsurprisingly, the Israeli government denied responsibility, claiming there were no IDF forces in the area. Yet numerous investigations leave little doubt as to the perpetrators of this war crime. Satellite imagery revealed that several armored IDF vehicles had been in the vicinity of the car. Audio analysis of recorded gunshots showed no indications of crossfire or an active battle, but rather a sustained barrage, firing at roughly 15 rounds per second. This rate of fire is in excess of typical Hamas weaponry, but is perfectly consistent with the machine guns on an Israeli tank. Further acoustic analysis revealing proximity indicates that the shooter would have been able to see inside the civilian vehicle and identify the civilians therein. As for the ambulance, it not only contained a 300mm hole consistent with an Israeli tank round, but was also found near fragments of an American-made M830A1 projectile. Simply put, this was not a mistake in the heat of battle.
This was the indiscriminate killing of unarmed civilians and aid workers.
Unlike the deaths of so many other Palestinians, this incident did receive substantial coverage in the Western media, who unsurprisingly contorted themselves into knots to avoid the reality on the ground. NBC Los Angeles reported, 6-year-old girl in Gaza goes missing after she is caught in the fighting. To be absolutely clear, Hind was not missing, and, if one is to believe the IDF's assertion that their forces were not in the area, there was no fighting. In contrast, when describing Israeli deaths on October 7th, NBC was eager to say that victims had been, quote, massacred by Hamas militants. The New York Times didn't fare much better, stating, missing 6-year-old and rescue team found dead. Later that same month, when the Times published yet another article about the Hamas attacks of the previous year, it described how Israeli residents were murdered on October 7th. In corporate Western media, Palestinian civilians are never murdered. They die, rarely they are killed, and sometimes they even manage to vanish into thin air. On February 29, 2024, thousands of emaciated Palestinians gathered in Gaza City in hopes of receiving a small portion of a scheduled aid delivery. When announcing the siege of Gaza, IDF Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant had previously stated, there will be no food, no water, and Israeli airstrikes quickly destroyed virtually all methods of food production. As the war dragged on for months, small amounts of aid were allowed in by other nations, but numerous international organizations reported that the Israeli government was deliberately stymieing attempts to get food into the territory. UK Foreign Secretary and former Prime Minister David Cameron wrote, "It is of enormous frustration that UK aid into Gaza has been routinely held up because of arbitrary denials by the government of Israel." Human Rights Watch reported, since October 7th, the Israeli government has deliberately blocked the delivery of aid, food, and fuel into Gaza, while impeding humanitarian assistance and depriving civilians of the means to survive. In early February, Israeli Minister of Finance Bezalel Smotrich even blocked a previously approved shipment of flour from the United States itself.
Along with state-sponsored starvation were numerous instances of Israeli soldiers and civilians blocking and destroying food deliveries.
As a result, 90% of Palestinians in Gaza regularly went without food by early 2024, and over 500,000 were at risk of imminent famine. It was in these desperate circumstances that 38 trucks passed through the Kerem Shalom checkpoint, reportedly escorted by Israeli tanks. As they entered the Al-Nabulsi roundabout, thousands of starving Palestinians approached the aid trucks, hoping to receive a portion of the flour bags and canned goods they carried.
In response, the Israeli troops opened fire on the crowd. At least 118 Palestinians were killed and over 760 were injured, making it the largest mass casualty event since the start of the war in Gaza.
Dr. Mohammed Saula, director of the Al-Auda Hospital, told reporters that roughly 80% of the wounded had gunshot wounds, with the remaining injuries attributed to the resulting stampede as the crowd fled the gunfire. Other hospitals and humanitarian organizations also reported a large number of gunshot wounds on the victims. Despite numerous eyewitness accounts of soldiers firing directly into the crowd, the IDF stated that it only fired, quote, a few warning shots to disperse the group, blaming the vast majority of deaths on trampling during the stampede. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir released a statement celebrating, quote, our heroic fighters operating in Gaza, who acted excellently against a Gazan mob.
So how should the Western media have conveyed the truth of these events? Well, let us look at how they reported on similar losses of life on October 7th.
A CNN article characterized the Hamas attacks on the Be'er kibbutz as a massacre, and further described the quote-unquote murder of residents. The New York Times reported on the quote slaughter of civilians at an Israeli music festival, and also used the term massacre when describing other attacks. Finally, the LA Times referred to October 7th as the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust.
Given their fondness for the term, one might have hoped that the Western media would have used similarly emotive language when describing what the rest of the world came to call the Flower Massacre of February 29th.
But such hopes would certainly have been dashed upon reading a CNN headline proclaiming at least 100 killed and 700 injured in a chaotic incident. Not to be outdone in sanitizing the actions of the Israeli military, the LA Times reported, many killed in Gaza aid disaster. Perhaps most astounding was the New York Times article titled, Lack of a Plan for Governing Gaza Formed Backdrop to Deadly Convoy Chaos.
Once again, the deaths of Palestinians are described like an act of God or a failure of planning, rather than the result of Israeli soldiers firing bullets into their bodies. For those wondering, the Cambridge definition of massacre is the killing of a large number of people not involved in fighting who have no way of defending themselves. As with the passive voice, the Western media seems at odds with the English language. Now, I've just discussed two atrocities that, despite the slanted way in which these war crimes were portrayed, were still relatively well covered. But I'd like to share with you the same sentiments a black friend once shared with me when discussing the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis PD. For every instance that manages to break through the media and reach the American people, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, that remain in the shadows. In just the first month following the Flower Massacre, there were an additional 3 attacks on Palestinian civilians waiting for aid. They occurred on March 3rd, March 14th, and March 23rd, and cost the lives of an additional 49 people and caused the injuries of roughly 200. There have been literally thousands of children and medical workers killed since the death of Hind Rajab. Recently, I found myself deeply upset when a friend suggested that all civilian casualties were the result of the Israeli bombing campaign. An aunt of mine in Gaza, an unarmed woman in her late 60s, was shot by Israeli snipers the moment she stepped out of the Catholic church she had been sheltering in. Do I need to explain to you that my aunt was not Hamas? Do I need to explain to you that Hamas does not shelter in Catholic churches? But despite the fact that there have been numerous reports of summary execution and numerous mass graves discovered in which dozens of Palestinian bodies have been found with their hands tied behind their backs and gunshot wounds to their heads and chests, the Western media continues to give the impression that all civilian casualties are simply the result of accidents during the bombing campaigns. Rather than take my word for it, listen to a doctor who recently returned from Gaza.
Targeting of children with gunfire. That I was not expecting to see, actually. I knew how many children had been killed. I knew about the massive killing in general, but I just assumed it was all from bombings. But that doesn't explain children getting shot in the head, and definitely not every day. I mean, literally every day I was there, I saw a child shot in the head. I kept the journal when I was there, and I just went through it because some reporters asked me to, and like quite literally every day I was there, I saw a child shot in the head.
These are lies of omission. And so as we talk about omission, let's finally dare to use that scary G word, genocide. On December 29, 2023, South Africa brought a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice for the genocide of the Palestinian people. For those curious about this polarizing term, the legal definition of genocide does not require the deaths of millions. According to Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, it requires any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. A. Killing members of the group.
أنتوا جوا السيارة؟
B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group.
T'as vu ces petits fils de p***, là, regarde, il s'est pissé dessus. Regarde, je vais te montrer son dos, tu vas rigoler, regarde.
C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life designed to bring about its destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In January of 2024, the ICJ held public hearings to determine if there was enough evidence to support a plausible case of genocide and if an investigation should commence. Both South Africa and Israel were given the opportunity to present their cases. Amazingly, numerous Western media outlets such as CNN and the BBC did not broadcast the first day of hearings in which South Africa presented its case against Israel, but did choose to broadcast Israel's defense against the charges. Just for a moment, ask yourself, how often do we see a trial in which we are presented with only the defense, but not the prosecution? Of course, had the media decided to broadcast South Africa's case, viewers would have seen many of the overtly genocidal statements from members of the Israeli government that the Western media has been largely ignoring. Statements such as the following.
זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק, מצטווה. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true.
Very puzzled by the constant concern which the world is showing for the Palestinian people and is actually showing for these horrible, inhuman animals who have done the worst atrocities that this century has seen.
אז לא תחזור להיות משהו, חמאס לא יהיה. חסל את הכל.
תכסחו אותם כמה שיותר, שלא נשים מהם זכר. שלא הם, לא אמא שלהם, לא הילדה שלהם, לא התינוקות שלהם. אסור להם לחיות לחיות האלה. יש לך שכן ערבי, אתה לא תחכה שהוא יבוא אליך הביתה. תיכנס אליו הביתה ותירה.
בסטלבט שלהם ובכיף שלהם, האנשים האלה, אין שם חפים מפשע ברצועת עזה, אין שם חפים מפשע, והעובדה שהם עכשיו מבלים בים, שנייה אחת, והעובדה שהם מבלים בים, במקום לרעוב, במקום להיות מטורטח, אנחנו היינו צריכים לראות שם הרבה יותר נקמה, הרבה יותר נהרות של דם של עזתים.
תשמיד את עזה עכשיו, עזה הופכת לדרזדן, כן.
הארץ שלנו.
Genocide scholars will argue that proving intent can be very difficult in these cases.
Nevertheless, statements like these and numerous others have led many experts to conclude that Israel has in fact met the threshold of genocidal intent. Among those willing to use the G word are Israeli-American genocide scholar Omer Bertov, Israeli-American genocide scholar Raz Segal, and Aryeh Nair, the co-founder of Human Rights Watch and a Holocaust survivor himself. On January 26, the ICJ voted 15-2 to proceed with the case, and that it is plausible that Israel has violated the Genocide Convention. Though a final ruling will likely take years and not be possible until the end of fighting, numerous other nations have declared their intention to join South Africa's case.
There is so much more I wish I had time to discuss, but I'd like to leave you with a moment that gave me hope. A doctor and aid worker on CNN who decided to lay bare the reality that those in power have been trying so hard to ignore.
This humanitarian crisis.
Kate, in all honesty, a humanitarian crisis is what you deal with when you have a hurricane, what you deal with when you have an earthquake. You have an insult and a humanitarian response. This is my career. This is what I do for a living. Every single person who does this for a living will tell you the same thing. This is different. This is not a humanitarian crisis. Kate, and I'm going to say it very clearly for your viewers to hear, this is genocide. When 70% of the population that are killed are women and children, when the population is starved of food, of water, of medicine, when you have attacks, repeated attacks on all the hospitals, the clinics, the aid distribution sites, churches, mosques, schools. And so it's really hard to hear it over and over and over again, framed in the way that it's being framed in the media, which frankly, Kate, is very misleading. It is very misleading. 365 days of this. Death tolls that are so far outdated. We have no idea how many people are killed, but I am genuinely afraid about what we're going to find out when the dust settles. History books will be written on this, and countries will have to reckon, media agencies will have to reckon with their major role in the genocide of an entire population and in the destruction of humanitarian law and rule of order.
This was a moment, albeit a brief one, of the truth breaking through. And this truth has the power to save lives. So I ask that anyone who believes that all lives are sacred, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity, to understand that by spreading the truth, by seeing the other side, you have the power to save lives. You don't need to be on CNN to break through. Remind your friends, family, and coworkers that there is another world in which Palestinian lives matter just as much as anyone else. Because that's the only world in which I, my wife, and our family can live. Thank you so much for your time.
We do have a question from the chat.
Yes.
Is the media language the result of pure racism against Arabs, or is it due to the media's fear of a backlash from a politically connected group, or from years of propaganda that has gone largely unchallenged and systemic and therefore unnoticed?
Well, I think there's a number of ways to address that. And the short version is it can be multiple things. This can be a yes and case. And I do think when we talk about politically correct groups, I actually value using the proper terminology. And that term is Zionism and people who are involved in sort of the Zionist lobby in this country, which does not apply to all Jews. One of the things which is really frustrating for me about how the media has presented this is that they have completely erased anti-Zionist Jews and other Jews who speak out against what's been happening there. So yes, I would argue some of this can be due to racism. Inherently, we see the media discuss about how we have more shared values with Israel, how it looks more like us. You can see people like Bill Maher talking about this, saying, oh, they look way more like us than the Palestinians do. But at the same time, there are U.S. interests involved with Israel. And much of the mainstream media wants to continue to have access to the White House and the powers that be and don't want to say things that will upset them and cost them the ability to be granted interviews. And when I say the media, I'm actually often not talking about the journalists, many of which have done amazing reporting and fought hard to get the truth out there. I'm talking about the editorial mandates that tend to come down and are often leaked through memos, through style guidelines, through those sorts of things. We've already seen this in the case of the New York Times, where they were specifically told reporters not to use the terms ethnic cleansing, genocide, or even Palestine or occupied territories. So once again, all of these things can be true. Racism is a factor, but so is self-interest. And I think in the history of oppressed people, this is usually the case, right? I mean, in general, when one group oppresses another, yes, some of them say, okay, we hate this other group. But others just like having the privileged status. Others just see that there is a benefit to them for allowing this to go on.
Thank you. Another question, do Americans truly understand Zionism? I'm not sure they do. Could you break it down for us a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's tough because I'm acutely aware that there is a large amount of legitimate anti-Semitism in the world. And often anti-Semites use the term Zionism and use and describe themselves as anti-Zionist when they really just are anti-Semitic. If you're Palestinian, you will get approached by anti-Semites who think they're your buddy. And this is one of the most awkward things in the world. But as it was laid out, Zionism was a colonial project to take people from Europe who happened to be of Jewish origin and relocate them to what was historical Palestine at the expense of the indigenous people who were already there. It was described by its founders as a colonial project, and it continues to be such a thing. It is founded on the idea that people there do not have equal rights. And this is something which is, once again, often not spoken about in the media. That, for instance, despite being able to trace my heritage there back hundreds and hundreds of years, I don't have the right to be a full citizen in there because my family lives in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Were my wife and I in Israel, we would not legally be allowed to be married because I am a Palestinian and she happens to be Jewish. These kinds of things, the fact that is inherently Zionism is based off of racial segregation and ethnic segregation, is not something which gets discussed enough. And recently, when people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, tries to talk about this, tries to compare it to, for instance, the Jim Crow South and his understanding of apartheid, you can see on many mainstream outlets how he is very, very quickly attacked and implied that he is anti-Semitic or deliberately leaving things out. I think inherently philosophies that are designed to segregate us create more hate, create more anti-Semitism, and create more anti-Arab and Muslim sentiment. I think that a world in which we treat people equally, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity, is the way we start to heal this problem we have.
We have time for a few more questions.
Yeah, the CBS interview, which you're speaking of, I personally found very upsetting. I think Coates did a very, for those who haven't seen it, I urge everyone to look it up because it has in fact gotten some blowback. He simply spoke of his experiences going to the West Bank and seeing what it was like when certain people were allowed to be in certain places because of their race or religion and others were not. Upon him discussing this, one of the hosts said first, "This sounds like the rhetoric of an extremist." And then, after he had talked further about some of the ways in which people are segregated, the host said, "Well, why is it you only have a problem with Jewish states?" And this is a kind of a clear example on how anti-Semitism is actually weaponized very frequently to shut down critics of Israel and the inherent philosophies of Zionism. And it's frustrating. Anti-Semitism isn't something we should be trivializing. No form of discrimination is something we should be trivializing. Yet we have this weird situation in which many in the media and many as part of this lobby want to simultaneously label the actions of Israel as part of the Jewish state, which I think is incredibly damaging, and then don't seem to understand the danger that puts a great many Jews in this country and around the world.
Okay, we have another one here. Americans are largely disconnected from the world events outside of the US, which many believe have nothing to do with us. This is obviously a problem. Aside from that, I heard Yuval Harari say that perhaps World War III has already begun with the genocide in Gaza, that like the two previous World War were ongoing for years before the US got involved. When Americans then acknowledged the conflict, or then acknowledged the conflict began. Do you see that happening here?
Honestly, forgetting just what's happened in the last year, thinking of the last 4 years, I don't think any of us can predict where the world is going. If nothing else, we are seeing a time of great strife. We're seeing a great many right-wing authoritarian regimes rising in different parts of the country. We're seeing a great amount of nativist sentiment across the world. I don't know where things are heading, but in talking about it in the context of previous world wars, I would direct you to people like I cited in there, like Omer Bartov, who have spoken so eloquently about what the Jewish experience was in the 1940s and prior, and what so many Jewish individuals learned from the Holocaust, and how frustrated many of them are that these same lessons are not being applied here. It's one of the things that has heartened me most in seeing what's occurred, to see other people who have been oppressed discussing how it's enlightened them, and to see so many sharing the view that never again means never again for anyone. Um, I wish in my soul the media was more willing to share that. I wish when they discussed the people who, for instance, when we hear about an anti-Semitic pro-Palestine protest, I wish they would bother to tell people that often they're sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not, no, and they're often run by Jewish individuals. It feels as though so much of the content is designed to divide us in a way that's very frustrating. And yes, I found that quote from Coates, "Your oppression will not save you," very moving, because I think it puts the onus on us of people who are dealing with trauma and oppression. What he was saying was is that merely being oppressed will not mean that you will come out of this experience enlightened and traumatized. You might, but you might also leave this experience feeling that might makes right, it's survival of the fittest, and be willing to victimize other people the way you've been victimized. But we all have that choice. We all can choose to say never again for anyone. We can all choose to say we are not tribal. No group is a monolith, and we will continue to fight for people who have less power. And that's the only way the world makes sense to me when I try to parse what often the news media calls difficult issues. I look at who has power and who doesn't. And I'm deeply frustrated how much energy is being spent by the US media, by the Western media, to pretend that one group of people does not have far more power than another.
We have time for one more quick question or insight or feedback. Do you think that part of this is that most Americans do not understand or relate to Islam and categorize Muslims as an other, besides the conflicts and wars that the US has been involved in over the last 2 decades?
Certainly. And, as an example, I spoke of my wife having a conversation where she felt someone was living in a different world. She had to explain to a family member that there are also Christian Palestinians, which is what my family happens to be. That there were, yes, Jewish Palestinians who existed there before the founding of the State of Israel. And this was very different than the colonial enterprise, which began with Zionism. I believe firmly in this culture, there is a vested interest in othering people from the Middle East. And yes, Muslims, but I also think that the way we sometimes simplify it as Muslims does not entirely uh, get to the issue. These days, we often use the term MENA or SWANA for Southwest Asian, North African, because we recognize that there's a set of shared values and a set of cultural things which tend to bind us. And I think very frequently in this country, we can be quite numb to the experiences of people from that part of the world. It's one of the reasons why it took us so incredibly long to finally acknowledge the Armenian genocide, which, as far as textbook cases of genocide, it's hard, like, there's not much more you need. And as we continue to see that throughout history, we see that in things like Rwanda and the Sudan and that kind of thing. We tend to be far less concerned with the suffering of people who have darker skin. I'm sorry to boil it down into something which seems so reductive. Yet, unfortunately, as we see with the way Ukraine was covered and the way which so much of the Western world suddenly rallied, it's true. It's what happens. We turn race into class. We turn power into class. And we've decided who we care about in this world, unfortunately.
Okay, one last quick. Is social media / fake news feeding into mainstream media?
I'm glad someone said this. Look, what sucks is the fact that the way the Western media has portrayed this means that it's very easy to be manipulated. I don't particularly love saying don't trust the mainstream media. I was here during COVID. I don't want people to think that, like, they should drink bleach or any of these other things that tend to be floating around. Sources of misinformation. And unfortunately, right now, the typical corporate media is a source of misinformation. So don't blindly believe anything you see on social media or Facebook posts, but do your research. Someone mentioned Democracy Now! That is a well-researched group. Middle East Eye does great reports. The Guardian has done some pretty good stuff. The Intercept is very well focused on this issue. They will cite their sources. They will show you what the data is. And then, yes, try to stay on Twitter and Instagram so you can see some of the footage that's actually coming out there. The stuff that the media doesn't want us to see or to believe our own lying eyes, as you would say. But it's harder. We have to put more work in than we normally would. We can't just trust what comes on our screens. We have to put in the work, and then we have to spread what we've learned, because that's the only way that people will start to see this for the genocide that it is, and may eventually change US policy. It's not something that will happen overnight, but the power of this perception is what's driving the genocide.
Well, thank you so very much, David, for sharing your film, sharing your message. I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us for the talk of the genocide gap, how the Western media bubble erodes empathy. This is being recorded, so you'll have access to watch it later. Matt, have a great rest of your day. Hopefully everybody is coming for part 2 of the From Conference tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.